So welcome back to part 4 of the Remove and Add Everything tracking series. Let's jump straight into our next scenario, which is the rock shop. As you can see, we got lots of rocks. What we focus on is how to bring in assets like this rock, color match it to existing materials in the scene, and also how to add these beautiful road markings, more road markings. However, these are texture painted as a nice alternative to having to plane track things, as it gives you sort of the advantage that you don't have to leave Blender to implement those details and having to, go to an external photo editor. The downfall of it, however, is that you will have to render these additions out as a image sequence if you want to composite it into your scene separately. Cool, so here we are on our camera. I'm using Blender Kit to bring in assets. The easiest way to do that really is shift right click to place your 3D cursor, because that is where Blender Kit will add your selected asset to the scene. Click the eye icon up in the top to bring up Blender Kit's user interface. Type, I don't know, large rock, hit enter and see what it does. There you go. If you want to, there's a filter option, free first, so that you don't have to worry about paying something right now. And then there's your previews as you hover over the images. Here's a table. There's our preview box. It fills up with green as it loads the asset in. Of course, we don't need a table there right now. We want rocks. So let's just go with rock 4, and this one pretty much loaded in no time at all. I select the rock, scale it up a bit because I want a massive boulder. I'll place the 3D cursor, shift right click right on that edge, jump out of the camera, zoomy in a little bit, and then press R. Oh, hold on. Period key, 3D cursor, and now press R so I can roll it around that edge. It's a nifty trick, I think. Same for this perspective here. I just wanted a little bit of shadow catchers under the rock so it doesn't just, so it's not so obvious that it just sinks into the ground. Perhaps we go back into the camera, G, Shift, Z to slide it across the ground plane without elevating it. R, Z to just bring it around a bit. I think that looks nice. Maybe just a tad down so it doesn't feel like it's kissing the wall quite as much. And let's just go with that. Let's just jump into our renderer. So what have we select? Yeah, select cycles, GPU, get rid of Blender Kit, and let's just Z render that. Actually Control B to select our region of interest, so rendering is a bit more responsive. And this is where we are. Now the obvious thing is our rock doesn't really fit with the existing material. Clearly this has moss on it, this doesn't. We also have less contrast and in general a different color cast, like the tonality is different. So let's just line this up before I'm waffling too much. That here is our base color, and I think we're just gonna start with the saturation. Let's bring down the saturation to something that we feel comfortable with. Values a bit so it doesn't seem to be quite so dark. Something like this starts to look alright. Let's get a curve in there as well, so that we can tackle the veins in there a little bit more. So I think like I just want to increase the dark areas by quite a bit so it's not so contrasty, and also maybe just lower the white values a bit so we have generally a lot more flat appearance, because that is sort of what I'm seeing with all the other rocks around. And then let's just have a look how this feels. Okay, this is definitely too much, so the value, I just bring this back down to 1, and then we just adjust the white values in the curves separately, and that feels about right. I think that is good. However, we have quite a strong blue cast here, so we're going to add a mix RGB node, bring that in, set that one to color, and then we just pick a color that feels like it could be right. So let's just dial back the factor a bit until things start to feel more natural. 0.25. All right, not too bad idea. Raising the levels a little bit there. Let's say 0.4 and just get the values up to 1.2. I think we're getting somewhere here. So, yeah. Okay, here we are. Beautiful. Look at this, guys. We reduced the saturation, we reduced the contrast, and we added a color tint to the final output to match what we have in the scene already. And then at the end, we slowly dialed in brightness and tonality until things really started to gel. So that is it. I'm pretty happy with that. So let's move on to texture painting. For that, I quickly jump into the top view. I select my ground plane. Beautiful. So here's my ground plane, and here's already a texture that I painted previously. Let's forget about it and create a new texture. Image, texture, there you go. This is what we want to see. Create a new one, new markings, and press OK. Let's jump into texture paint. Tab, texture paint, and let's select a texture. Boom. So this texture comes from Ian Hubert. Thanks, Ian. I'm going to use the checkerboard and straight lines for this maybe. So something that everyone can very easily recreate on their own. So let's jump into the brush settings then. We want to define the mapping of the brush as a stencil, which brings in our texture right away. Oopsie daisy. Right click to move the texture. Otherwise the viewport works as normal. So right click to move the texture, shift right click to scale it, and control right click to rotate it. Now, yeah. So let's just place the texture. I might just line it up a little bit like this. Maybe just increase the strength as well. Here we go. That looks better. There you go. Beautiful. And then X to get rid of that. And then we can right click, move the texture a little bit ever so gently, and keep going. That looks good. And then why don't we just make it real big? Here we go. Just for the fun of it. So painted it. Doopy doopy doop. Doopy doopy doop. Let me quickly see what we have. This is what we have painted. Now let's get into the weathering. We don't want this thing to be freshly painted. It should be worn. So for that, our mapping should be changed to view plane. Our fall off should be changed to just go for, I don't know what we want, smooth. That will give us, as you can see, smooth fall off. And as you also noticed, hopefully, we're still painting with our texture. That is not what we want. Press the X, and now you have a smooth brush. Beautiful. Now let's creating something a little bit more natural. Bring a little bit of jittery. Shift F lets you reduce the intensity of the brush, and then we just and so there it is. This gives you a little preview of how your markings could look like. You now need to render those out as a separate sequence. So for that, I would set my foreground elements, the rocks and everything, perhaps to hold out. So it would look like that. That one as well, hold out. Do a little test render so you know what you're roughly getting at. Specify a pass, new markings, underscore, and have it as an open EXR with DWAA lossy, RGBA full float, and that will give you a sequence that could look somewhat like this. And we will use that as a mask in our composite now. So here you see our markings in there already. There's a boulder. We also matched the shadows already, but we will get to that in part 5 when we bring in the Porsche and get into the nitty-gritty things of gelling really everything. And there's so much that it really deserves its own chapter. So here's our boulder. Nothing too special about it, really. We just alpha over it. Here's our background with shadows already. I tend to render the shadows separately, and I get to that in the next part. And we bring them over with alpha over, so really straightforward there. However, the attention needs to be paid when it comes to markings here, because we don't just want to bring in the markings as black and white, right? So here's our mix node, and it's set to overlay. So what overlay does, it makes things brighter as well as darker. And remember what we learned in the previous parts in Photoshop. Wherever we want to weather away the freshly painted markings, we don't just want to reveal the unchanged texture below, we want to reveal new information. So we don't just want to fade it out, in other words. Overlay will help you here because we have two elements coming in. One is our original footage from the drone, and the second one is our markings, which have been colored. And the markings that we painted, we only used as a mask. See, they go into the vector for this mix RGB node, which is set to color. This is how we got the yellow. If I disable that, will I get anything? Yeah, I will get white markings. I wanted yellow markings, and therefore a mix RGB node set to color. This RGB curves node here is there to control the saturation a bit better. It was just way too intense, and by dialing things back a bit, I just nailed this weathered look a bit more. It doesn't make sense if things are perfectly saturated and flush, but also weathered. In my mind, that doesn't go hand in hand. So with this node here, I increased the exposure of the drone footage, but it got way too hot there. And so I clipped the highlights, just dialed it back a bit, and that was then fed into our first slot. The second slot is just the color, and the vector coming from our mask is controlling where we want to change the color, right? And then these feed into the overlay node. Here comes the shadows and our 3D elements, and we got everything. So this concludes part 4 of the Trick Everything Blah 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 series. Join me in part 5, where we will be adding the Porsche and really go into the nitty-gritty things of gelling things together by having interactive reflections as well as matched shadows to live action references in this shot. Click up there, and I see you soon.